The ion storm hit Meridian Colony like the fist of an angry god. Brennan Locke was 3 rows deep in the hydroponic arrays when the emergency klaxons tore through the agricultural dome's recycled air. His hands stilled over the nutrient sensor he had been calibrating. The reading flickered, then died as the power grid stuttered into emergency protocols. Red warning lights bloomed across every surface, painting the rows of engineered wheat in shades of blood. He didn't run. Running in a crisis got people killed. Instead, Brennan moved with the deliberate speed of a man who'd learned that controlled urgency saved more lives than panic ever could. The emergency kit hung on the wall exactly where it should be. His fingers found the familiar weight of it, trained reflexes overriding the part of his brain that wanted to process what the sensors were screaming at him. Something massive was falling through the upper atmosphere. Something that had torn through the colony's defensive grid like it didn't exist. The storm filled the viewports now. Violet energy twisted reality into fractured patterns, bending light until it hurt to look at directly. Brennan had seen ion storms before. Every colonist on Meridian had. They were part of life this close to the Orion Belt's unstable stellar nurseries, but he'd never seen one that made the ground move like this. The impact wasn't an earthquake. It was something worse. The agricultural dome lurched sideways with the specific violence of catastrophic structural failure. Brennan caught himself against the quarter wall, his shoulder taking the impact hard enough that he'd feel it tomorrow. If there was a tomorrow. The smell hit him before he saw the wreckage. Hot metal and something acidic that made his sinuses burn. Underneath that, something organic and wrong. The kind of wrong that his medical training recognized as trauma, as injury, as the specific chemistry of a body failing. The fighter craft had carved a path through the protein synthesis vats like a blade through flesh. Sleek black hull with purple accents that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The design was beautiful in the way that apex predators were beautiful. Efficient, deadly, completely alien to anything human engineering had produced. Valoran military hardware. Brennan had seen the briefings, the intelligence reports that filtered down even to frontier colonies like Meridian. He knew what those colors meant. Elite operative, assassination class. The kind of warrior who got sent when the Valoran Empire wanted something done quietly and permanently. The cockpit hatch was jammed. Brennan didn't waste time with the manual release. 3 years as Meridian's only trained medic had taught him that hesitation killed patience. He grabbed a hydraulic pry bar from the nearest tool station and worked the seal, feeling his muscles burn as he leveraged against the frame that had been designed to withstand combat stresses he couldn't begin to imagine. The hatch shrieked as it gave way. Metal tearing, seals breaking, the pressurized atmosphere inside the cockpit releasing in a rush that smelled like ozone and fear. She was still conscious. That was the first surprise. She was also the most dangerous-looking being Brennan had ever seen. That was the second. The armor covering her torso and arms was a marvel of biomechanical engineering that made human combat suits look like children's toys. Deep purple and obsidian panels that seemed to shift in the emergency lighting, embedded with circuitry that glowed an unsettling amber. The material looked almost liquid, flowing across her body like it was part of her skin rather than covering it. But when Brennan's eyes tracked the damage, he saw the fractures. Spiderweb cracks spreading across her left shoulder, where the impact had compromised the armor's integrity. And from those cracks came fluid that looked disturbingly like blood, though it ran the color of old rust. Her face was severe, sharp angles, high cheekbones, skin that held an undertone of purple, even beneath the visible injuries. White hair hung in strands matted with residue from the crash, pointed ears, eyes that snapped to his the moment the hatch opened, the color of amethyst caught in direct sunlight. For one terrible second, Brennan wondered if he'd just made the last mistake of his life. Then her expression shifted. Pain flickered through it, vulnerability breaking through whatever military conditioning had trained her to show nothing. Her hand moved toward him, and every instinct Brennan had screamed at him to step back, to get away from whatever defensive systems that armor contained. He didn't move. His medical training had already cataloged the injuries. Internal hemorrhaging, broken ribs, something wrong with her respiratory system that his eyes couldn't see but his experience recognized. She was dying. Not immediately, but inevitably. And she knew it. Her fingers made contact with his bare forearm, where his sleeve had ridden up. 5 of them, impossibly delicate for such a powerful-looking being. The touch was tentative, testing like she expected pain. The armor's amber glow shifted. It deepened to gold, then settled into a rhythm that Brennan's medical instincts recognized immediately. It was matching his pulse. The armor was reading his heartbeat through skin contact and synchronizing to it. The reaction was unmistakable. The armor recognized his touch as safe. Brennan had no framework for understanding why. He filed it away as a problem for later and moved into the mode that had kept him functional through every crisis Meridian had thrown at him. Assessment, stabilization, transport. Everything else could wait. Don't try to move. His voice came out steadier than he felt. You've got internal injuries. Hemorrhaging. I need to get you to medical. She tried to speak. It came out as a cough that brought blood with it, the same rust-colored fluid leaking from her armor's fractures. Her hand didn't let go of his arm. If anything, her grip tightened, not with violence, but with the desperation of someone whose body was failing and who just found the only anchor in reach. The armor pulsed again where they connected, that warm illumination spreading from the contact point like ripples in still water. Don't remove it. She managed the words between shallow breaths. Her accent was thick, angular, shaping human speech in ways that suggested it wasn't her first language. The fusion won't release. If you try to cut it. Another cough cut her off. More blood. Brennan was already working, securing her position within the compromised cockpit seat, immobilizing her spine to prevent further injury. The suit she wore under the armor was white, some kind of smart fabric that was already responding to her injuries by adjusting compression in damaged areas. I'm not removing anything right now. Brennan pulled the portable stasis field from his kit. I'm keeping you alive. What's your name? Kata. Each word seemed to cost her something. Valoran military operative. Designation. I don't need your designation. Brennan was already fashioning a medical transport cocoon around her, using the stasis field to suspend her injuries in a state of temporal slowdown. It wasn't a fix. It was a bridge between now and actual medical equipment. I need you to breathe shallowly and let me work. He should have been terrified. A Valoran warrior, the kind sent on classified military operations, had just crashed into his colony. The political implications alone were enough to trigger an interstellar incident. But Brennan's hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd stopped 3 reactor technicians from bleeding out after an explosion last year. Fear could wait. The patient in front of him couldn't. Your armor. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. When I touch it, what happens? Kaida's eyes were losing focus, the stasis field's temporal effects taking hold. Her body floated in suspended animation, except for her eyes. They tracked him with the intensity of a predator, even in her diminished state. Something in your biochemistry. Her voice was fading. You're not attacking it, not marking it as threat. That made no sense. Brennan filed it with all the other impossibilities and focused on the immediate problem. He had a medical facility 200 meters away. He had equipment that could probably stabilize her long enough to figure out what he was looking at biologically. What he didn't have was time to waste on questions that didn't serve the immediate goal of keeping her alive. Getting her out of the wreckage required equal parts improvisation and structural engineering. The seat she was strapped into had to be removed with her still in it. The armor's fusion to her skin was visible at the seams where it met flesh. Biological welds at a molecular level that made Brennan's medical training scream warnings about tissue damage and nervous system integration. When he touched the edges of those seams, trying to assess if separation was even theoretically possible, the armor responded again. That calming amber light deepening to gold, like it was saying safe, safe, safe in a language older than words. She was unconscious by the time he'd rigged the transport cradle. Her breathing had become shallow, inadequate. The stasis field was holding her injuries in a managed crisis state, but managed only meant temporary. Brennan lifted her from the wreckage, surprised at how light she was despite the armor's obvious weight, and began the sprint through failing colony quarters. The ion storm was clearing, but the damage to Meridian's infrastructure was already catastrophic. Emergency protocols routed him away from the worst structural failures. His body moved on pure momentum while his mind spiraled through differential diagnoses, treatment protocols, and one persistent question that he couldn't answer. What was she? And why did her armor think his hands were safe? The medical facility's lights bloomed green as he entered, automated systems recognizing a critical emergency, activating full support protocols. Brennan had configured this space himself when he'd arrived at Meridian 3 years ago, with nothing but credentials and a desperate need to be useful somewhere far from Earth's increasingly paranoid genetic research restrictions. The examination table rose from the floor, sensors already active. Brennan positioned Kaida's transport cradle with the care of someone handling live ordnance. Full spectrum scan, he ordered the AI. His hand secured her position. Biological and technological integration analysis. Priority? Stabilize fusion points. I need to know what I'm looking at. The AI's voice was professionally calm. Initiating analysis. Warning subject physiology outside standard database parameters. Recommend consultation with override full diagnostic now. The machinery hummed to life, light washing across Kaida's body in waves that created a three-dimensional rendering of her internal systems. Brennan's breath caught as the data resolved into something his medical training had no reference point for. The armor wasn't just attached to her skin, it was fused at the cellular level, its structure integrated into her musculature, her nervous system, her very biological code. The fractures weren't just mechanical damage. They were biological wounds, like cutting through flesh and bone simultaneously. And the poison was obvious. Where the armor was broken, her own cells were trying to compensate, overproducing tissue to seal the breaches. But the armor wasn't inert metal. It was still active, still trying to maintain functionality even as it failed. The result was a cascade of biological rejection, her immune system attacking the foreign material while her consciousness remained bound to it. She was dying, not quickly but inevitably. Brennan's hands moved across the diagnostic controls, running test after test, searching for something that would give him a path forward. The scan data was incredible and useless in equal measure. Yes, he could see the problem. No, nothing in his training offered a solution. He was still running diagnostics when her eyes opened 14 hours later. Kaida's hand moved faster than human reflexes should have allowed, but she didn't strike. Instead, her fingers found his wrist, holding it with enough strength that he felt the tremor in her muscles. Weakness, not violence. Her eyes were unfocused, caught between consciousness and the medical sedatives the facility had automatically administered. "Your hands," she whispered, her accent thicker now, slurred with pain and pharmaceuticals. I don't know." Brennan answered honestly. He should have maintained clinical distance. Instead, he found himself sitting in the chair beside the examination table, his free hand reaching out to touch the unbroken section of her armor. Warm light bloomed beneath his palm, spreading across her shoulder in slow waves. "But we're going to find out." She didn't answer. Her eyes closed again, but her grip on his wrist didn't loosen. Brennan sat in that medical facility, his hand on an alien warrior's armor, watching diagnostic readouts that refused to produce a solution. And he made a decision that would reshape everything. He was going to save her, even if he had to do it with his own hands. The next 3 days established a rhythm that became as necessary as breathing. Every 4 hours, Brennan's hands found the fusion points where Kaida's armor met her body. The armor responded each time with that warm glow, and each time the cellular rejection cascade slowed just enough to buy her more time. Not healing, not yet. But the timeline between now and her death stretched from days into weeks. She remained conscious more often as the hours passed. Between treatments, they talked. Or rather, Kaida talked, and Brennan listened while his hands worked, stabilizing fusion points with a precision that was part medical expertise and part something he couldn't name. The bonding began in childhood. Kaida's voice carried the weight of someone processing trauma they'd never had permission to acknowledge. "I was 7. Valoran military protocols identify genetic compatibility for armor integration starting at age 5. If the testing confirms compatibility, bonding occurs 2 years later, when neurological development is advanced enough." Brennan's hands stilled for just a moment. They bond children to combat armor? Children considered for elite service positions. She said it matter-of-factly, the way someone describes standard procedure. The armor and host develop together. Neural pathways form around the integration. By adulthood, the bonded warrior has adaptive combat capability that unenhanced soldiers can't match. He filed away the implications of weaponizing children and focused on the medical reality. If she'd been bonded at 7, her entire neural architecture was built around this armor. The fusion wasn't just technological, it was developmental. Removing it wouldn't just cause tissue damage. It would be neurological amputation. I can't remove it, he said, not as diagnosis but as acknowledgement of reality they both needed to face. I know. Kaida's eyes found his. But you can stabilize the cascade. You're already doing it. Your touch is the only thing keeping me alive. The weight of that statement settled between them. She was entirely dependent on him, not just on his medical knowledge, but on the specific biochemistry of his hands. Whatever made the armor recognize him as safe was the only thing standing between her and the poison spreading through her body. On the 4th day, Brennan made a decision that violated every protocol about maintaining clinical distance from patients. He ran a genetic test on his own blood. The results made him sit down hard in his chair. Valoran genetic markers, dormant but present, woven through his DNA like echoes of something ancient. They shouldn't be there. Human genetic code had been mapped and documented for centuries. These markers weren't in any database. They shouldn't exist in his bloodstream, but they did. He found Kaida awake when he returned to the examination room. Her eyes tracked him with the sharpness of someone who'd been trained to read micro-expressions, to assess threat levels from the way a person moved. Your armor, Brennan said without preamble. It recognizes genetic compatibility, family lines. You said it won't attack kin. Yes, Kaida's voice was wary. I ran a genetic analysis on myself. He pulled up the results on the medical display, orienting it so she could see. I have Valoran markers in my DNA, dormant but present. That's why your armor thinks I'm safe, isn't it? It recognizes me as kin. Kaida stared at the data for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried something like wonder and something like horror in equal measure. That's impossible. Humans and Valorans are separate species. Different evolutionary paths. Different stellar origins. Apparently not, Brennan gestured at the undeniable evidence floating between them, which means someone lied, either about where humans came from, or about where Valoranians came from, or about the relationship between us. He watched her process this, watched the military operative's trained composure fracture just slightly as the implications cascaded through her understanding of reality. If you carry Valoran genetic markers, she said slowly, then humans aren't a separate species. You're descended from us. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Brennan had spent 3 years on Meridian because his family had been quietly exiled from Earth's genetic research establishment. Too many questions about human origins, too much data that didn't match the official narrative of natural evolution. His father had given him a password before they'd scattered to different colonies, told him it would unlock the truth if he ever needed it. He'd never needed it, until now. I need to access the restricted archives, Brennan said. The colony's classified genetic research files. If my family hid something here, something about human origins, we need to know what it is. Kaida's expression hardened. Why would I help you access classified human intelligence? I'm Valoran military. Even if She paused, choosing words carefully. Even if circumstances have complicated my mission, You're still dying, Brennan interrupted. And the answer to why my hands work, why your armor recognizes me, why any of this makes sense, is probably in those files. Help me, because understanding this might be the only way I can actually save you instead of just delaying the inevitable. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, a gesture that carried the weight of choosing collaboration over duty, answers over allegiance. The password his father had left him unlocked archives that made Brennan's hands shake as he read. The Genesis Project, 30,000 years of documented history, genetic templates, development progressions, a complete biological schematic for the evolution of humanity from engineered stock. Humanity wasn't evolved. Humanity was created. Created by the Valoran Empire as a labor species, designed to be advanced enough for complex tasks, but dependent enough to be controlled. The project had spanned millennia, careful genetic manipulation across generations, seeding worlds with populations that would develop according to predetermined parameters. And then something had gone wrong. Or right, depending on perspective. The human species had developed unpredictably. Consciousness emerged in ways the Valoran designers hadn't anticipated. Choice, Free will, the capacity to question and resist and build civilizations that exceeded their original programming. By the time the Valorant Empire discovered that their abandoned labor project had achieved spacefaring capability, it was too late to control them through genetic programming. So the Empire had chosen a different path. Pretend humanity didn't exist. Minimal diplomatic contact, distant trade relationships. No acknowledgement that humans were essentially Valorant descendants who'd evolved beyond their intended parameters. Brennan looked up from the terminal to find Kaida staring at the data with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your empire created us," he said quietly. "And then when we became too complicated to control, you just ignored us, pretended we were a separate species." "Not me." Kaida's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. None of this was in our intelligence briefings. We were told humans were a separate evolutionary line, a potential security concern because of genetic anomalies that—" She stopped. Her eyes widened. "Genetic anomalies," she repeated. "That's what my mission briefing said. Eliminate the settlement at Meridian Colony due to genetic anomalies representing a security threat." Brennan felt something cold settle in his chest. This colony was founded by genetic researchers, my family, others like them, people who'd been asking questions about human origins, running analyses that didn't match the official story. "Your evidence," Kaida said, and now her voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "This entire colony is evidence that humans are Valorant descendants. That's why you were targeted. That's why I was sent here." She pushed herself up from the examination table with visible effort, her body still weak, but her need to move overriding physical limitations. "I need to access my fighters' communication systems. I need to see the full mission briefing." Brennan helped her stand, his hands automatically steadying her when she swayed. The days of constant contact had made touch between them natural, necessary. His hands found her waist without thought, and the remaining armor sections pulsed with warm recognition in response. They made it to the fighter bay together, Kaida leaning on Brennan's support, her pride warring with her body's limitations and losing. The crash vessel sat exactly where colony security had left it, already cataloged as salvage pending investigation into the incident. Kaida's fingers moved across the control interface with ingrained precision. Access codes, encrypted files, layers of security that peeled back under her authorization. The mission briefing materialized on the screen, and Brennan watched her face as she read something she'd apparently never been cleared to see in full. Operation Progenitor Purge. Her voice had gone flat, the affect of someone retreating from emotion because the alternative was breaking. Systematic elimination of 17 human colonies identified as containing genetic research evidence. Meridian Colony, Priority Target 1. Operative assigned, Kaida Veyron, Elite Designation. She scrolled through more data, her fingers trembling now. Recommended approach. Catastrophic systems failure during reconnaissance. Create plausible accident scenario to justify military response if elimination cannot be accomplished covertly. Brennan understood before she said it. Your navigation system wasn't sabotaged by an enemy. It was sabotaged by your own command. They wanted me to crash. Kaida's hand found the bulkhead, steadying herself. They wanted it to look like an accident. Either I'd complete the elimination and they'd have plausible deniability, or I'd die in the crash and they'd have justification for a retaliatory strike. Either way, Meridian gets destroyed. She turned to face him, and in her eyes, Brennan saw the exact moment when a soldier realized she'd been sent on a genocide mission disguised as security protocols. "I was sent to kill children," she whispered, "genetic descendants of my own species. And I would have done it. I would have followed orders without question if I hadn't crashed. If you hadn't saved me, if your hands hadn't proven that humans and Valorans are the same bloodline." Brennan moved to her without thinking, his hands finding hers, holding them with the same certainty he'd used to stabilize her fusion points. "You didn't do it. You're here now. You know the truth now. That matters." "Does it?" Kaida's voice broke. 16 other colonies are still targeted. 16 other operatives who don't know they're being sent to commit genocide. And I can't stop them because I'm barely alive. Because my own empire wants me dead along with everyone you care about. She pulled her hands from his, and Brennan felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. She moved to the fighter's storage compartments, opened one with shaking fingers, and pulled out the first section of external armor. The shoulder guard, its surface still bearing the scars from the crash. I need you to remove this. Kaida held the piece toward him. Not the fused sections, not yet, but the external armor, the parts that detach. I need it gone. Why? Because I've worn this since childhood. Her eyes met his, and in them Brennan saw vulnerability that went deeper than physical injury. Because it's all I've ever been. A weapon, a tool, something shaped and pointed at targets and told to eliminate threats. And I'm asking you to help me become something else. Brennan took the shoulder guard from her hands. The metal was warm to his touch, and when his skin made contact, it glowed that familiar gold. Safe. Kin. The armor recognizing him as someone who wouldn't harm its host. This is going to take time, he said. Days, maybe longer. Each piece needs to be removed carefully. Then we have time. Kaida's hand found his face, her palm against his jaw in a gesture that was intimate in ways that had nothing to do with medical necessity. Because I have to report to my command in 7 days. And before I do that, before I decide whether to betray you or betray my empire, I need to know who I am without this armor. Brennan understood what she was asking. This wasn't just about physical removal of equipment. This was about identity, about choosing vulnerability over protection, about trusting him with more than just her life. 7 days, he said, starting tomorrow. We'll remove one section per day, carefully, safely. Starting now. Kaida's voice was firm. I don't want to wait. I want to feel what it's like to have skin that isn't covered in armor, even if it's just my shoulders, even if it's just for tonight. So Brennan worked in the dim light of the fighter bay, his hands steady as they found the release mechanisms for the shoulder guards. Pressure points that his touch activated where the armor recognized him as safe enough to disengage. The pieces came away with the soft sound of biological seals releasing, connections that had been maintained for over 2 decades finally separating. Underneath, Kaida's skin was marked with the pattern of long-term compression. Scars where the armor had pressed against her body through combat, through training, through every moment of her existence since childhood. Her muscles trembled as air touched her exposed shoulders for the first time in her conscious memory. Brennan's hands moved across the newly revealed skin, checking for damage, for pressure sores, for any sign that the removal had caused harm. His touch was clinical, professional, until Kaida made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between pain and release and wonder. Her hand found his, pressing his palm flat against her bare shoulder, and Brennan realized she was crying. I'd forgotten, she whispered. I'd completely forgotten what it feels like to be touched without armor between my skin and the world. Brennan didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would match the weight of what she'd just revealed. Instead, he kept his hand where she'd placed it, letting his warmth become the thing she felt instead of protective plating, letting his presence become the answer to years of isolation. They stayed like that until the fighter bay's lights cycled to night mode, until Kaida's trembling stopped, until she pulled back with eyes that were clearer than he'd seen them since the crash. 7 days, she said. Help me become something other than a weapon. And then I'll decide what comes next. Brennan nodded. 7 days, one piece at a time. Neither of them said what they both knew. That in 7 days, Kaida would have to choose between the empire that had shaped her entire existence and the truth that was unraveling everything she'd believed about herself, about humans, about the nature of loyalty and duty, and what it meant to be kin. Day 8 began with Kaida's hands on the forearm sections of her armor. Brennan found her in the medical facility's observation room at dawn, her fingers tracing the seams where metal met flesh. She'd been staring at the armor for an hour, he could tell, the kind of contemplation that came before irreversible decisions. I'm ready, she said without turning. The forearm plates, today. He moved to her side, his presence a quiet constant that had become as necessary as the stabilization treatments. You don't have to rush this. Yes, I do. Kaida turned to face him, and in the pale morning light, her exposed shoulders looked almost fragile without their armored guards. I have 6 days before I have to report to my command. 6 days to decide if I'm going to lie to my empire or betray everyone on this colony. I need to know who I am without this armor before I can make that choice. Brennan understood. The armor wasn't just protection. It was identity, purpose, the physical manifestation of everything she'd been trained to become since childhood. Removing it meant confronting the question of what remained underneath. The forearm sections came away more easily than the shoulder guards had. Years of wear had created a rhythm to the release mechanisms, automatic responses that Kaida's body remembered, even if her conscious mind had never questioned it. But when Brennan's hands found the final seals, when his touch activated the biological locks that recognized him as safe, the armor separated with a sound like a sigh. Kaida's forearms were scarred. Combat training had left its mark in thin white lines across her purple-tinted skin, burns from energy weapons, impact fractures that had healed poorly, the accumulated evidence of a warrior's life written in scar tissue and trauma. Brennan's fingers moved across the newly exposed skin with professional precision, checking for nerve damage, for circulation problems, for any indication that the long-term compression had caused permanent harm. His touch was gentle, clinical. Until Kaida caught his wrist, held his hand flat against her forearm and said, "I can feel everything." Her voice carried wonder and something close to fear. "The temperature of your skin, the calluses on your palm, the way your pulse beats against my wrist. I haven't felt any of this since I was 7 years old." Brennan looked at her face and saw tears tracking down her cheeks, not from pain, from the overwhelming sensation of experiencing touch and without barriers for the first time in her conscious memory. "Is it too much?" he asked quietly. "No," Yada's grip on his wrist tightened. "It's perfect. It's terrifying. It's—" She stopped, searching for words that didn't exist in military protocols or tactical briefings. "It's making me realize how much I've lost, how much was taken from me when they bonded me to this armor." Day 9 brought the chest plate. This removal was more complicated. The armor covering Kaida's torso was integrated with respiratory support systems, structural reinforcement that had been compensating for injuries she'd sustained years ago. Removing it meant trusting that her body had healed enough to function without mechanical assistance. Brennan prepared the medical suite with equipment that could provide emergency respiratory support if her lungs failed without the armor's help. Backup systems, contingency protocols, all the careful plannings of someone who understood that removing life support was a calculated risk. Kaida watched him work with an expression he was learning to read. Calculation mixing with vulnerability. Military assessment colliding with genuine trust. "You're afraid I'll stop breathing," she said. "I'm being cautious." Brennan checked the emergency ventilator for the 3rd time. "There's a difference." "Brennan." She waited until he looked at her. "If something goes wrong, if my body can't sustain itself without the armor, I don't want machines keeping me alive. I want to know that I tried, that I chose this." He wanted to argue. Medical ethics demanded he do everything possible to preserve life. But he'd also learned over the past 9 days that Kaida's choices were her own. His job was to give her the safest possible path to what she'd already decided. The chest plate came away in sections. First, the upper portion, revealing collarbones that bore the permanent indentations of armor that had rested there since childhood. Then the lower sections, exposing ribs that had been compressed by protective plating for over 2 decades. Kaida's breathing hitched when the final piece separated. Not from pain, but from the sudden awareness of air moving against her skin without barriers. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, testing breaths. Brennan's hands were already on her ribs, feeling for the expansion pattern, checking lung capacity, monitoring the respiratory rhythm that should have been automatic, but felt strange after years of mechanical assistance. "Breathe slowly," he instructed. "Let your body remember how to do this without help." Kaida's hand found his shoulder, gripping hard enough that he felt her trembling. Each breath was an effort, a conscious act that had to override years of relying on the armor's support. But each breath also came easier than the last. Her lungs remembered. Her diaphragm remembered. Her body was reclaiming functions it had delegated to technology. "It hurts," she admitted after several minutes. "Everything hurts. My ribs feel like they're going to collapse. My lungs burn. Even my heartbeat feels wrong without the armor regulating it." "That's normal." Brennan's voice was steady, even though he was monitoring her vital signs with the intensity of someone watching a patient on the edge of crisis. "Your body is adjusting. The pain will decrease as your muscles remember how to work independently." She nodded, still breathing carefully, still fighting through the discomfort of freedom. That night, Brennan found her standing in front of the observation window in his quarters. She'd asked to stay there instead of the medical facility. Wanted to see the stars without examining equipment surrounding her. Wanted to exist in a space that wasn't defined by her status as patient or prisoner, or whatever complicated category she occupied. She'd wrapped herself in one of his shirts. The fabric hung loose on her frame, designed for human proportions rather than Valoran physiology. But it covered the exposed skin that she wasn't quite ready to leave bare, gave her a layer of protection that wasn't armor. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Kata said when she heard him enter. "About the report I'm supposed to send. About what happens if I tell my command the truth." Brennan moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence but not touching, giving her the choice of contact rather than assuming it. "What happens if you tell them the mission failed?" he asked. "They send a recovery team. Or more likely, they send a strike force to eliminate both the failed operative and the target that wasn't neutralized." Kata's reflection in the window glass looked haunted. "Either way, this colony gets destroyed. And if you report success, then Meridian appears to be eliminated, and they move to the next target on the list. 16 more colonies, 16 more operatives who don't know they're committing genocide against their own genetic descendants." She turned to face him, and in her eyes, Brennan saw the weight of impossible choices. "I can save this colony by lying, but then I'm complicit in the destruction of 16 others. Or I can tell the truth, and Meridian burns along with any chance of stopping the remaining operations." "There's another option," Brennan said carefully. "What option?" "The Genesis Project files. Everything my family archived about human origins, about Valoran genetic engineering, about the 30,000-year conspiracy. If that information becomes public, if it's released to every independent network in human space simultaneously, your empire can't suppress it. The truth becomes impossible to hide." Kaida was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "You're suggesting I commit treason. Real treason, not the kind that comes from failing a mission, but the kind that comes from actively working against my government's interests. I'm suggesting you stop a genocide." Brennan's voice was steady. "The rest is just classification." She studied his face, searching for certainty or doubt or any indication of what he actually wanted her to do. But Brennan had learned over 9 days that Kaida needed support, not direction. She needed someone who would stand with her regardless of what she chose, not someone who would make the choice for her. "If I do this," she said slowly, "if I release those files, I can never go back. I become a traitor to the Valoran Empire, an exile, someone without a home or a people or any identity beyond the person who betrayed everything she was raised to protect." "Yes. And you're asking me to make that choice?" "No." Brennan's hand found hers, their fingers threading together with the naturalness of a gesture they'd repeated hundreds of times during stabilization treatments. "I'm telling you that whatever you choose, I'll help you do it. If you want to send a false report and buy time, I'll help. If you want to release the files and face the consequences, I'll help. If you want to do something else entirely, something neither of us has thought of yet, I'll help. Your choice, not mine." Kaida's grip on his hand tightened. "I want to stop this, all of it. The purge, the lies, the systematic elimination of people who are my genetic kin, whether my empire wants to acknowledge that or not. I want to burn it all down and force both our species to face the truth." "Then that's what we'll do." She pulled him closer, her free hand finding his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with the kind of focused attention that came from experiencing touch as revelation rather than routine. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple." Brennan's hand came up to cover hers, holding her palm against his cheek. "It's probably going to get us both killed, but it's right, that's enough." Kaida kissed him then, not tentatively, not with the uncertainty of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, but with the fierce certainty of someone who'd made a decision and needed the physical affirmation of another person's presence to make it real. When she pulled back, her voice was rough with emotion. "There's one more piece of armor that needs to come off before I can do this. The spinal cord, the sections that are fused directly to my nervous system." Brennan's medical instincts immediately cataloged the risks. The spinal integration was the deepest level of armor fusion, neural interfaces that had been part of her biology since childhood. Removing them without specialized Valoran medical equipment could cause paralysis, could sever the connections between brain and body that allowed for movement and sensation. That's the most dangerous removal, he said carefully. If something goes wrong, then you'll fix it. Kaida's certainty was absolute. You've kept me alive for 9 days with nothing but your hands and improvised medical protocols. You've stabilized fusion points that should have killed me. You've removed armor sections that I've worn since childhood. You can do this. Kaida, I need to be free of it, Brennan. Her voice carried the weight of years of isolation, of being bound to armor and duty, and an identity that had been chosen for her before she was old enough to understand what she was agreeing to. I need to know that when I commit treason, when I burn my entire life down to stop a genocide, I'm doing it as myself, not as a weapon, not as an operative, as Kaida, just Kaida, and I can't be that person while the armor is still part of my spine. Day 12 began before dawn. Brennan had spent the night preparing the medical suite with every piece of equipment that might help if the spinal armor removal went catastrophically wrong. Neural monitors, spinal stabilizers, emergency surgical tools that he prayed he wouldn't need. Kaida arrived as the first light touched Meridian's horizon. She'd removed the shirt she'd been wearing, standing in the medical facility, wearing nothing but the white undersuit and the final sections of armor that ran along her spine from the base of her skull to her lower back. I'm ready, she said. The procedure took 6 hours. Brennan's hands moved with microscopic precision, finding the biological seals that connected armor to spinal cord, feeling for the neural interfaces that had grown into her nervous system over 2 decades. Each connection had to be separated carefully, the armor's systems gently disengaged from the biological systems they'd been supporting. Kaida remained conscious through all of it. Her choice. She wanted to feel every moment of separation, wanted to experience the exact instant when the armor that had defined her existence finally let go. Brennan felt it when the first spinal segment released, a subtle shift in the way Kaida's nervous system responded to his touch, like a biological sigh of relief. The armor's warm glow intensified, then faded as the connection severed. Safe. Kin. Letting go. I can feel it, Kaida whispered. The difference, like there's space in my spine that's been compressed for so long, I'd forgotten it existed. Brennan moved to the next segment, his hand steady despite the knowledge that one wrong move could destroy her ability to walk. Tell me if anything feels wrong. Numbness, tingling, loss of sensation anywhere. Nothing feels wrong. Her voice carried something like wonder. Everything feels more right than it has in years. The final segment was the most difficult. The armor at the base of her skull had the deepest neural integration, connections that fed directly into her brainstem and controlled autonomic functions that kept her alive. Removing it meant trusting that her body could regulate heartbeat and breathing and all the unconscious processes that the armor had been managing since childhood. Brennan's fingers found the seals with the precision of someone who'd spent 9 days learning every centimeter of Kaida's armor, every place where technology met biology. He felt the locks disengage under his touch, felt the recognition signal pulse one final time. Then the armor came free, all of it. Every piece of the spinal cord that had been fused to Kaida's nervous system since she was 7 years old. It separated from her body with a sound like a breath being released after being held too long. Kaida gasped, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of existing in her own body without technological mediation for the first time in her conscious memory. Her back arched, muscles discovering they could move in ways the armor had never permitted. Her hands gripped the edges of the medical table hard enough to leave marks. Brennan was already scanning her vital signs, checking neural responses, monitoring everything that could indicate the removal had caused damage. But the readouts were stable, better than stable. Kaida's body was functioning independently, reclaiming processes it had delegated to armor for decades. How do you feel, he asked. Kaida turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was something Brennan would remember for the rest of his life. Joy and grief and wonder all mixed together, the look of someone who'd just discovered they were capable of freedom. Like myself, she said. For the first time ever, I feel like myself. She moved off the medical table with the careful precision of someone testing new limits. Her balance was different without the armor's weight. Her posture had to adjust to moving without external support, but she moved with increasing confidence, each step an act of reclaiming her own body. When she reached Brennan, she didn't stop. Her hands found his face, his shoulders, his waist, mapping his body with the same focused attention he'd given to her armor's fusion points. But this wasn't medical. This was need, recognition, the physical expression of trust that had been building between them for 9 days. "I want you," she said simply. "Not as a medic, not as the person keeping me alive, as you, as Brennan, the man who freed me from armor I didn't know I could live without." Brennan's response was to kiss her, to pull her closer, to let his hands remember every place where armor had been and find the skin underneath. They moved together to his quarters, neither willing to waste time with words, when touch communicated everything that mattered. When they came together, it was Kaida's first experience of intimacy without barriers. No armor between her skin and another person's. No technological mediation of sensation. Just flesh and warmth and the profound vulnerability of allowing someone to see and touch and know every part of her that had been hidden since childhood. Afterward, lying in the darkness of Brennan's quarters, Kaida made her final decision. "I'm uploading the Genesis files," she said, "tomorrow. Before I send any report to my command, I'm releasing every piece of evidence about human origins, about the Valoran genetic engineering project, about Operation Progenitor Purge. I'm making it impossible for my empire to hide what they've done." Brennan's arm tightened around her waist. "That's treason." "Yes," Kaida's voice was steady. "That's exactly what it is. And I'm choosing it, not because you asked, not because I was forced, because it's right. Because genocide is wrong regardless of what military protocols or classified operations say about security concerns. What do you need from me? Help me rig the transmission. Your geneticist friend Cassandra, she'll have access to the full archives. Your administrator Thea, she'll need to know what's coming because this is going to bring a Valoran military response that your colony isn't prepared for." Kaida turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his in the darkness. "And when it's done, when the files are public and my empire sends ships to destroy this place and everyone in it, I need you to get on my fighter and escape with me, because I'm not letting you die for a choice I made." "Our choice," Brennan corrected. "This became our choice the moment I decided to save you instead of letting you die in that wreckage. We're in this together now." Day 13 began at 2 in the morning. Kaida composed the false status report with the clinical precision of someone who'd been trained in military communications protocols since childhood. "Mission in progress. Target assessment complete. Require 72 additional hours for intelligence gathering before final action. Maintaining communications silence until confirmation." She sent it through encrypted channels, then turned to Brennan. "That buys us 3 days, maybe, if my command believes I'm still on mission." The response came 18 minutes later. Not through standard military channels, but through an encrypted back channel that Kaida recognized immediately as belonging to Commander Thessa Corvin, the officer who'd overseen her training, who'd recommended her for elite operative status, who'd been a mentor before Kaida had even understood what mentorship meant. "I know what you found." Thessa's message was text only, no voice, no video, untraceable except by someone who knew her communication patterns. "I know about the Genesis files. I know you've learned what Operation Progenitor Purge really is. I'm buying you time, but I have maybe 18 hours before I'm ordered to Glass Meridian Colony and eliminate all evidence. Upload your files now. Make this worth what it's going to cost both of us." Kaida stared at the message for a long moment, then looked at Brennan. "She knows. My commanding officer knows I've discovered the truth, and she's giving me permission to commit treason. Or she's setting a trap," Brennan said carefully. "No." Kaida's certainty was absolute. "Thessa taught me everything I know about tactical operations. If she wanted to trap me, I'd never see it coming. This is her trying to help without violating her own oaths directly. She's giving me the space to do what she can't." At 3 in the morning, they gathered in the fighter bay. Kaida, Brennan, Cassandra Reeves with the complete Genesis Project archives on encrypted data cores, and Thea Armstrong, who'd authorized access to the colony's long-range communication array. "This is going to bring hell down on us," Thea said, but she was already linking the archives to Kaida's fighter transmission systems. "You understand that? The moment these files go public, every Valorant ship within range is going to converge on Meridian. I know. Kaida's hands moved across the control interface, configuring simultaneous transmission to 47 different networks. Earth government archives, colonial university systems, independent news agencies, scientific institutions, every possible destination that could receive and preserve and distribute the information. That's why you're evacuating. The moment this upload completes, you get every person on this colony into the underground shelters. You make sure that when the Valorant response comes, it finds infrastructure and data stores, but no people to kill. Cassandra was already routing the data through multiple relay points, making it impossible to interrupt the transmission once it began. These files represent 60 years of research, 3 generations of genetic scientists who dedicated their lives to understanding human origins. My grandmother started this work. My mother continued it. I'm finishing it. Whatever happens next, at least the truth will be out there. Brennan stood beside Kaida, his presence a quiet anchor while she prepared to destroy everything she'd been. Ready? He asked. Kaida's hand found his, their fingers threading together one last time before the world changed. Ready. She initiated the upload. The progress bar began its crawl across the screen. 1%, 5%, 15%. The Genesis Project files spreading across human space like a virus that couldn't be contained or suppressed or denied. 30,000 years of history, genetic evidence of Valoran engineering, documentation of humanity's creation and abandonment in the systematic plan to eliminate the evidence. At 47%, the alarms began. Valoran override protocols detected, unauthorized transmission identified, security countermeasures activating. But it was too late. The files were already replicating across multiple networks, spreading faster than any containment system could track. Cassandra's routing protocols had done their job. The truth was out there, independent of Meridian, impossible to suppress even if the colony burned. At 75%, everything changed, not Valorant override protocols, physical proximity alerts. Lieutenant Eric Saren's scout ship dropped out of the debris field directly above the fighter bay, weapons hot, targeting solutions locked. Brennan's display lit red. He's charging main cannon, impact in 40 seconds. The bay won't survive the hit. Kaida's hands flew across controls. Upload progress, 76%. If they evacuated now, if they broke transmission, the files would be incomplete. Usable maybe, but not everything, not the full evidence that could stop all 17 targets. Thessa's voice cut through the chaos on military channels. Saren, stand down, that's an order. Respectfully, Commander, my orders come from high command. Eliminate the traitor and all evidence. I'm sorry. 30 seconds. Upload, 79%. Kaida's hand hovered over the emergency disconnect. Save themselves. Let incomplete files spread. Hope it was enough. Brennan's hand covered hers. Finish it. We'll die. Then we die with the truth out there. All of it. Kaida made her choice. She locked the transmission protocols, made the upload unstoppable even if the bay exploded, and grabbed Brennan's hand. 20 seconds, 84%, 15 seconds, 89%, 10 seconds, 94%. Thessa's voice again, broadcast on override channels that made every Valorant ship in range hear her. Lieutenant Saren, you fire on that bay. You're not just killing a traitor. You're destroying evidence that will expose Operation Progenitor Purge to every human in Valorant who's listening to this transmission. Is that really what High Command wants? Public execution broadcast across both species? 5 seconds, 98%. Saren's weapon held charge. Didn't fire, didn't stand down. 100%. Upload complete. Kaida's hands were shaking as she pulled Brennan toward the fighter. Go. Now. They ran. Behind them, the fighter bay doors began to seal. Thea's voice over the colony-wide system. All personnel to emergency shelters. This is not a drill. Evacuation protocol Omega. Move now. Kaida and Brennan reached the damaged fighter, strapping themselves into pilot and co-pilot seats with hands that moved on pure adrenaline. The systems were still compromised from the crash, still running on improvised repairs and emergency patches. But the engines worked. The navigation systems worked. The neural interface that connected Kaida's nervous system directly to the ship's controls worked. And for the first time since she was 7 years old, Kaida piloted without armor. The sensation was different, cleaner. Like the signal between her brain and the ship's systems didn't have to route through layers of protective technology anymore. Her thoughts became thrust vectors, navigation solutions, evasive maneuvers that the damaged fighter executed with groaning protest, but absolute obedience. They lifted off just as Saren's scout ship opened fire. Not on them, on the fighter bay they'd just evacuated. The structure collapsed in a controlled demolition that would have killed them if they'd been 30 seconds slower. Kaida pushed the engines beyond safe parameters, the damaged systems screaming in protest, but responding to her neural commands. They punched through the atmosphere, into the black of space, and Brennan got his last glimpse of Meridian Colony below them. 2,000 people sheltering underground while their infrastructure burned. His home for 3 years, the place he'd chosen when Earth had made it clear his family's research wasn't welcome. Thea got them out, Kaida said, somehow knowing what he was thinking. I can see the shelters on thermal. Everyone's underground. The strike force is hitting empty buildings. Then they were past orbital range, into the debris field where ion storm remnants made sensors unreliable and pursuit dangerous. Kaida flew like she'd been born to it, which in a sense she had. Her neural integration with Valorant fighters meant the ship responded to her thoughts as much as her hands. Behind them, Meridian burned. Ahead of them, neutral space and diplomatic station Artemis in a future that neither of them could predict. 3 Valorant interceptors appeared on sensors, closing fast. Kaida didn't try to outrun them. The damaged fighter couldn't sustain combat velocity. Instead, she used the debris field threading between ion-charged fragments with precision that made Brennan's breath catch. They're gaining, he said, watching the tactical display. I'm not trying to escape. Kaida's voice was steady despite the alarms filling the cockpit. I'm trying to make pursuit expensive enough that they'll accept letting us go. She dove into a cluster of debris that would have torn the fighter apart if she'd miscalculated by meters. The interceptors followed, but cautiously. Even Valorant combat pilots had survival instincts. Commander Thessa's voice filled the cockpit through military channels. Interceptor Squadron, this is command. Disable the target vessel. Do not destroy. Repeat, disable only. Operative Kaida Veyron is wanted for tribunal, not execution. One of the pursuing pilots responded immediately. Commander, the target is entering hazardous debris. Pursuit at current velocity risks. I'm aware of the risks, Lieutenant. Thessa's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Reduce velocity. Maintain visual contact. Do not fire to kill. The interceptors slowed. Not much, but enough that Kaida gained precious seconds, precious distance. Enough to reach the boundary where Valoran jurisdiction ended and neutral space began. Brennan was staring at her. She's letting us go. Your commander is actively helping us escape. Thessa taught me everything about being a warrior. Kaida's voice was rough with emotions she didn't have names for. Now she's teaching me how to be a traitor, how to choose principle over orders. She's been waiting for someone to do what I just did. Maybe she's been waiting for permission to do it herself. The fighter crossed into neutral space with alarms screaming about engine failure and hull breaches. But they were across. Beyond the reach of Valoran military authority, into the diplomatic no-man's land where neither empire nor colony held jurisdiction. Diplomatic Station Artemis appeared on sensors like a promise of sanctuary. Human-built, jointly administered, the one place where Valoran and human representatives could meet without either side claiming territorial advantage. Kaida's hands were shaking as she guided the dying fighter toward the station's docking bay. 13 days ago, she'd been a weapon. A tool pointed at targets and told to eliminate threats. Now she was a traitor in a failing ship, carrying evidence that would reshape the relationship between two species whether they wanted it or not. The docking clamps engaged with a thud that reverberated through the hull. Kaida's neural interface disconnected from the ship's systems, and for a moment she felt profoundly alone. No armor, no ship, just herself in a body that still remembered what it felt like to be bound to technology. Brennan's hand found hers. Warm, real, grounding. We made it, he said. We made it to the next problem. Kaida's laugh was shaky. Now we face whatever comes next. Commander Thessa's voice came through one final time, on a private channel that only Kaida would recognize. I'm letting you go. Reach Artemis. I'll meet you there. What you did today, what you chose, it matters. More than you know. More than I could ever say through official channels. Fair skies, Kaida. You were the best operative I ever trained. You'll be an even better conscience for both our species. The transmission ended. Kaida sat in the pilot's seat, her hands steady on controls that no longer responded, her entire body free of armor for the first time since she was 7 years old. What happens now? Brennan asked. Now we run. Wow, shonen, Kaida said, and we hope that the truth we released is enough to stop the other 16 colonies from burning. We hope that exposing genocide is worth becoming traitors. We hope that choosing conscience over duty means something in the end. She glanced at him, and in her eyes Brennan saw certainty mixed with fear, mixed with something that might have been hope. We hope, she said again, and we survive. Together. What came next was immediate detention. Station security met them at the airlock with weapons drawn but not aimed. Professional courtesy extended to refugees who might be criminals or might be heroes depending on which government you asked. Kaida Veyron, the security chief, was human, female, carrying herself with the kind of competence that came from managing diplomatic crises on a daily basis. You're wanted by the Valoran Empire for treason. Earth government has requested protective custody. You're both being detained pending tribunal proceedings. Kaida nodded. She'd expected this. And the Genesis files? 3.1 billion downloads across human networks in the last 6 hours. The security chief's expression was carefully neutral. Earth government has confirmed the authenticity. So have 4 independent scientific institutions. You've started something that neither government can stop now. They were separated. Kaida to a detention suite that was comfortable enough to not be a cell, but secure enough that escape was impossible. Brennan to guest quarters with security monitoring. Not together, not yet. The station wasn't ready to make that kind of statement about their relationship. Kaida spent the first night alone, staring at walls that reminded her of the isolation she'd experienced her entire life. Alone in her armor, alone in her purpose, alone in a body that had been shaped by duty since before she was old enough to understand what she was sacrificing. But the aloneness felt different now. She'd chosen it. She'd walked away from the only identity she'd ever known. And the solitude that followed was consequence rather than condition. Day 14 brought news. Meridian Colony had survived. Thea Armstrong's evacuation had saved all 2,000 residents. The Valoran strike force had destroyed infrastructure but killed no one. Commander Thessa had apparently given very specific orders about acceptable targets. Day 15 brought more. The Genesis files were spreading faster than any government could contain them. Analysis confirmed what Kaida and Brennan had discovered. Humanity was genetically descended from Valoran engineering projects, abandoned 30,000 years ago, now targeted for systematic elimination. Day 16, Earth government representatives arrived at Artemis. Formal delegations, legal teams, politicians who wanted to turn Kaida into either a hero or a scapegoat, depending on which narrative served their interests. Day 17, the Valoran delegation arrived, military prosecutors, defense attorneys, representatives of an empire that was fracturing between reformists who opposed progenitor purge and hardliners who saw Kaida as a disease that needed excision. Day 18, the tribunal began. The chamber was designed for exactly this kind of proceeding. Neutral territory, with representatives from both species seated in positions of equal authority. Kaida stood in the center, lone, facing judgment from 2 civilizations that wanted very different things from her. The Valoran delegation was led by a military prosecutor who'd never met Kaida but spoke about her like she was a disease that needed excision. Operative Kaida Veyron stands accused of treason against the Valoran Empire. Unauthorized disclosure of classified materials, violation of military protocols, and active collaboration with enemy forces. The recommended sentence is execution. The Earth government representative was more sympathetic, but no less serious. We recognize Kaida Veyron's actions as potentially heroic, but we cannot ignore that she was sent to our colonies as an instrument of genocide. Her cooperation is appreciated, but her legal status remains complicated. Kaida listened to them debate her fate like she wasn't standing right there. She'd expected this. Legal proceedings were always about frameworks and precedents and the careful language that let governments avoid saying what they actually meant. When they finally asked her to testify, to explain herself, Kaida looked directly at the assembled representatives and spoke with the clarity of someone who'd already made peace with whatever judgment came next. The bonding began in childhood. I was 7. Her voice carried through the chamber with the kind of projection that came from years of military briefings. Valoran military protocols identify children for armor integration based on genetic compatibility. I spent the next 2 decades as an operative. I followed every order. I completed every mission. I never questioned the purpose behind my assignments because questioning wasn't what I was designed for. She paused, letting the weight of those years settle over the room. Then I was sent to Meridian Colony with orders to eliminate a settlement that represented a genetic anomaly. I crashed. A human medic named Brennan Locke saved my life. And in saving me, he revealed something my government had been hiding for 30,000 years. Kaida pulled back her sleeve, showing her forearm where the armor had been removed. The scars were visible, the pattern of long-term compression, the physical evidence of what she'd survived. Humans aren't a separate species. You're our descendants. Created by Valoran genetic engineering, abandoned when you evolved beyond the parameters we designed, and now targeted for elimination because your existence is evidence of our shame. The chamber erupted in noise. Representatives shouting over each other, demanding clarification, denying implications, trying to control a narrative that had already escaped their grasp. Kaida waited for silence. When it came, she continued, I released the Genesis files because genocide is wrong. Whether it's dressed up as security protocols or classified operations or protection of imperial interests, it's still genocide. Operation Progenitor Purge was designed to eliminate 17 human colonies, thousands of people. My genetic kin, even if my empire refused to acknowledge that relationship. She looked directly at the Valoran prosecutor. You want to execute me for treason. I understand. I violated every oath I ever took. I betrayed my command structure. I chose conscience over duty. But I won't apologize for stopping genocide. I won't apologize for choosing to save lives over following orders. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. Execute me if you want. The truth is still out there. My death won't change what I've already exposed. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Commander Thessa Corvin stood. She'd been sitting in the Valoran delegation section, quiet until now, letting the proceedings unfold. But when she rose, every eye in the chamber turned to her. I am Commander Thessa Corvin of the Valoran Imperial Fleet. Her voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of service. I supervised Operative Kaida's training. I recommended her for elite status. I authorized her deployment to Meridian Colony, and I am here to testify that everything she has said is true. The chamber erupted again. This time the Valoran prosecutor was on his feet, demanding that Thessa be removed, that her testimony be stricken, that this entire proceeding be declared compromised. Thessa ignored him. She pulled a data core from her uniform and held it up for everyone to see. This contains classified files documenting Operation Progenitor Purge in its entirety, mission parameters, target lists, authorization chains that go directly to Valoran High Command. I am submitting this as evidence. I am also formally requesting political asylum from Earth government, as I can no longer serve an empire that orders genocide against its own genetic descendants. The prosecutor was shouting now, but Thessa's voice cut through the noise. Kaida Veyron didn't cause this crisis. She exposed it. There's a difference. I should have done the same thing years ago when I first learned what Progenitor Purge actually was. I didn't have her courage. I followed orders instead of conscience. That's my shame to carry. But I'm carrying it here now, publicly, so that everyone in this chamber understands that this isn't about one operative going rogue. This is about an entire military command structure being forced to confront the reality that we've been planning systematic genocide. She looked directly at Kaida, and in her eyes was something like pride mixed with regret. You were the best operative I ever trained. You'll be an even better conscience for both our species. Then Thessa sat down, and the chamber descended into chaos that took hours to restore to order. The tribunal lasted 10 more days. Testimony from Dr. Cassandra Reeves about the genetic research, evidence from Thea Armstrong about Meridian's evacuation, technical analysis of the Genesis files that confirmed their authenticity beyond any possible doubt. And through it all, Qaeda stood in the center of the chamber, facing judgment from two species that were still processing the reality that they were related by design rather than separated by evolution. On day 22, 4 more Valorant officers requested asylum, following Thessa's lead, bringing their own evidence of progenitor purge's scope and authorization. The Valorant delegation fractured, reformist faction against hardliners, arguments about what loyalty meant when orders required genocide. On day 25, Earth government formally recognized that humans and Valorans were genetically related species, not conquerors and conquered, not separate evolutionary paths. Family, separated by 30,000 years in one empire's choice to abandon a project that had exceeded expectations. On day 27, the tribunal reached its conclusion. Operative Qaeda Varen, the lead arbiter, was human, chosen specifically for neutrality in matters where both governments had competing interests. This tribunal finds that your actions, while technically constituting treason under Valoran military law, were morally justified given the genocidal nature of Operation Progenitor Purge. You are pardoned by Earth government for any crimes against humanity. The Valoran Empire's charges are being reviewed by their reformist government, which has formally suspended Progenitor Purge pending investigation into its authorization. The arbiter paused, consulting notes. You are free to return to Meridian Colony if you choose. You are also free to accept asylum on Earth or any human settlement. Commander Thessa Corvan and the 4 officers who defected with her are granted protected status. The tribunal recommends that both governments establish formal diplomatic protocols for addressing the genetic relationship between species. Qaeda had expected relief. Instead, she felt hollowed out. 27 days of testimony, of justifying choices she'd already made, of being examined like a specimen that might be hero or criminal depending on which angle you viewed her from. They let her see Brennan that night, first time since they'd arrived at the station. He looked older, worn by weeks of his own testimony, his own examination. But when his arms came around her, when his hands found her back where the armor scars were still visible, Qaeda felt something in her chest unlock. It's over, he said against her hair. The tribunal is over. Qaeda's voice was muffled against his shoulder. The rest is just beginning. What do you want to do? She pulled back to look at him. I want to go back to Meridian. I want to help rebuild what my empire destroyed. I want to be there when the first human and Valoran scientists start working together to understand the genetic engineering that created your species. I want to prove that what we chose, what we did, can lead to something better than genocide. Brennan's smile was tired but genuine. Then that's what we'll do. 5 years later, Meridian Colony had become something neither species had imagined possible. The agricultural dome had been rebuilt with hybrid technology, human engineering integrated with Valoran biological systems. The population had grown to 4,000, split evenly between humans and Valorans who'd chosen to live on the world where the truth had first been exposed. Qaeda stood in the medical facility's observation room, looking out over the reconstructed settlement. The building was new, designed by architects from both species, but this specific room had been preserved exactly as it was when Brennan had first brought her here days after her crash. The examination table was gone, replaced with modern equipment, but the observation window remained, offering the same view of the agricultural sector where her fighter had carved its path through protein synthesis vats. And on the wall, in a climate-controlled display case, was her armor. Not the whole suit, just the shoulder guard, the first piece Brennan had removed. The surface still bore the warm glow preserved in stasis, a permanent record of the moment when her armor had recognized a human's touch as safe. The plaque beneath it read, "The armor that bound her, the hands that freed her, the choice that freed us all." Earlier that morning, Qaeda had mediated a dispute between human colonists and Valoran engineers over water rights in the southern sector. The humans wanted efficiency. The Valorans wanted biological integration with existing ecosystems. She'd found the middle ground the way Brennan had taught her to find fusion points, carefully, with respect for both sides, with understanding that different didn't mean incompatible. The agreement had taken 4 hours. Both sides left satisfied. That was the work now, not warfare, not elimination of threats, Just the patient, unglamorous labor of teaching two species how to share space without conflict. Through the observation window, she could see Brennan's medical theater. 20 students, mixed human and Valgarin, gathered around a holographic display showing hybrid anatomy. Brennan's hands moved through the projection, highlighting where Valgarin's cellular structure met human adaptations in patients born after the species integration began. One student, Valgarin, asked about armor fusion protocols for civilian applications. Another human questioned whether genetic markers could be used for disease prediction. Brennan answered both with the same patience he'd shown when stabilizing her fusion points 5 years ago, teaching them that medicine wasn't about species separation, it was about understanding biology in all its forms. Ambassador Veyron, the voice came from behind her, familiar, carrying authority even in retirement. Thessa Corvin stood in the observation room doorway, silver threading her hair now, civilian clothes strange after decades of military uniform. She'd been living on Meridian for 3 years, teaching tactical ethics at the colony's new defense academy. "Commander," Kata said automatically, "just Thessa now." The older woman moved to stand beside her, looking at the armor display. "Do you ever miss it? The certainty of orders?" "Every day," Kata admitted, "and never. Does that make sense?" Thessa's smile was shaded knowing. Perfect sense. They stood together in silence. Two warriors who'd chosen conscience over command, watching the world they'd helped create through choices that should have gotten them both killed. Brennan's reflection appeared in the window glass beside Kaida's. 5 years of working together had added silver to his hair, lines around his eyes that came from smiling more than stress. He was chief medical officer now, but he still made time for teaching, for the hands-on work that had defined his approach to medicine since before Kaida had crashed into his life. Thessa excused herself with a knowing look, leaving them alone in the observation room where their story had begun. "Do you ever regret it?" Brennan asked quietly. "What you gave up, what you chose?" Kaida considered the question seriously. 5 years ago, she'd been a weapon. Purpose without choice, identity without freedom, a body that existed only to serve military objectives she'd never been allowed to question. Now she was something else entirely. Someone who chose her purpose every day. Someone who'd learned that freedom meant carrying the weight of your own decisions. Someone who'd discovered that intimacy without armor was worth every sacrifice. "Never," she said. "You saved my life that day. But more than that, you gave me the space to save myself, to choose who I wanted to be instead of accepting what I'd been designed to become." She turned to face him, her hand finding his with the automatic ease of a gesture they'd repeated thousands of times. "I was 7 years old when they bonded me to that armor. I didn't choose it, didn't understand what I was agreeing to, but I chose this. I chose you. I chose to stop genocide. I chose freedom over purpose. And I would make that choice again every day for the rest of my life." Brennan's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "The rest of your life is a long time." "Good." Kaida's smile carried everything she'd learned about being human in the years since her armor had come off. "I want to see what we build with it, what humanity and Valorans create together now that the truth is out, what it means to be kin instead of separate species." Through the observation window, she could see humans and Valorans working side by side in the agricultural sector. Scientists collaborating on genetic research that would have been impossible 5 years ago. Children from both species playing together in the reconstructed gardens, growing up in a world where the relationship between their peoples was acknowledged rather than hidden. "We did this," Brennan said, following her gaze. "You and me and Thessa and everyone who chose truth over comfortable lies. We changed everything. We started it." Kata's hand tightened on his. "The rest is up to them, up to everyone who comes after us. We just proved it was possible, that choosing conscience over duty could lead somewhere other than execution or exile." A notification chimed on Kaida's communication device. Another request for her testimony, this time from a Valoran university researching the ethical implications of Operation Progenitor Purge. Another group of students who wanted to understand how one operative's choice had reshaped galactic politics. She'd speak to them. She always did. Because the story of what happened on Meridian wasn't just her story anymore. It was evidence that change was possible, that systems could be challenged, that genocide could be stopped by individuals willing to risk everything for principle. But first, she had this moment. This quiet morning in the observation room where Brennan had first stabilized her armor's fusion points. This space where she'd learned that his hands could free her in ways that had nothing to do with medical procedures and everything to do with trust. "I love you," she said, and the words still felt new even after 5 years. "I don't think I understood what that meant when we first came together. I thought it was gratitude or dependence or the biological response to someone whose touch kept me alive. But it's more than that. You're the first person who ever saw me as something other than a weapon, who gave me permission to become someone other than what I was designed to be." Brennan's kiss was gentle, familiar, carrying the weight of 5 years of choosing each other every day. When he pulled back, his voice was rough with emotion. "You freed yourself. I just had the right biochemistry to make it possible. Everything else, all the choices that mattered, those were yours." "Ours," Kata corrected. "They were ours." She reached out, her fingertips touching the climate-control glass that separated her from the armor she'd worn for over 2 decades. The warm glow pulsed once in response, faint, like recognition from something that remembered being alive. "It still knows you," Brennan said quietly. "It knows what I was." Kaida's hand dropped. "I'm someone different now." She turned away from the display case, from the armor that had defined her childhood and the choice that had freed her adulthood, and found Brennan waiting, his hand extended, not demanding, just offering. The same way he'd offered his hands that first day in the wreckage. The same way he'd offered to remove her armor piece by piece. The same way he'd offered to stand with her when she'd chosen treason over duty. Kaida took his hand, threading their fingers together with the ease of 5 years of choosing each other, and walked toward the door. Behind them, the plaque glowed softly in the morning light. The armor that bound her, the hands that freed her, the choice that freed us all. But that wasn't quite right, Kaida thought as they stepped into the corridor where human and Valoran voices mingled in easy conversation. The choice hadn't freed everyone. It had just proven that freedom was possible. The rest, the daily work of building something better than genocide, the patient labor of teaching two species to be family instead of strangers, that was the real freedom. And it would take more than one warrior's choice to complete. It would take generations. But they'd started it. And that, Kaida decided as Brennan's hand squeezed hers, was enough.